The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as Marcus Rodriguez pushed his janitorial cart down the empty corridors of Pinnacle Financial Tower at 2:47 a.m. 23 floors of gleaming marble and glass that housed one of Manhattan's most prestigious investment firms. The same halls where executives in $1,000 suits had called him invisible just hours earlier. Where his supervisor Janet had pulled him aside after the quarterly board meeting to deliver the news that still burned in his chest. "Budget cuts," she'd said, avoiding his eyes. "Your position's being eliminated next month." 37 years old, a Bronze Star recipient, and they were tossing him aside like yesterday's coffee grounds. The security monitor at his belt crackled with static. "Rodriguez, you copy," came the voice of Tommy Chen, the night security guard who'd become his only real friend in this corporate fortress. "Yeah, I'm here," Marcus replied, stopping near the executive elevator bank. "Just finished 22. One more floor and I can clock out." Tommy's laugh carried a bitter edge. "Another thrilling night in paradise, huh? At least you get to see sunlight when you leave." Marcus almost smiled despite everything. Tommy worked the graveyard shift too, but unlike Marcus, he'd never served overseas, never held a dying friend in his arms, never learned that courage meant something more than quarterly profit margins. 8-year-old Sophia was probably dreaming right now in their cramped Brooklyn apartment, her small arms wrapped around the stuffed elephant her mother had given her before cancer took her away 3 years ago. Marcus worked these late hours so he could walk her to school each morning, see her bright smile as she chattered about her drawings and her friends. The job paid barely enough to cover rent and groceries, but it gave him what money couldn't buy, time with his daughter during the precious hours when she was awake. The elevator dinged softly as it reached the 23rd floor, executive country, where decisions were made that affected thousands of lives with the casual indifference of moving chess pieces. Marcus had cleaned these offices for 18 months now, emptying trash bins filled with the detritus of wealth, wiping down conference tables where his military experience was dismissed as irrelevant to the business world. He'd stopped mentioning his MBA earned through night classes during his service. Education meant nothing when you wore coveralls and pushed a mop. As he rounded the corner toward the northeast corner office, something felt different. The emergency exit door that should have been locked stood slightly ajar, a thin wedge of darkness visible in the otherwise sterile hallway. Marcus paused, his military training kicking in automatically. In Afghanistan, details like this had meant the difference between coming home and coming home in a box. He reached for his radio to call Tommy, but stopped. The security cameras would show him reporting another false alarm. Janet was already looking for excuses to accelerate his departure. Instead, Marcus approached the door quietly, every sense heightened. Through the gap, he could hear voices, low and urgent, speaking in what sounded like Arabic. His heart rate spiked as memories flooded back, not of fear, but of purpose. For the first time in months, his training felt relevant. He pressed himself against the wall and listened. 6 men, maybe 7, discussing timing, positions, exits. Words he recognized from his deployments, tactical language that made his blood run cold. They were inside the building, armed, organized, and they were planning something for 3 o'clock sharp, just 13 minutes from now. Marcus's mind raced through possibilities. A robbery seemed too simple for this level of coordination. The building housed classified government contracts, foreign investment portfolios, data that could destabilize markets. This wasn't about money. This was about maximum damage. His hands shook slightly as he pulled out his phone, muscle memory from countless night patrols guiding his movements. No signal. They were jamming communications. Professional, military-grade operation. Marcus felt a familiar calm descend over him. The same clarity that had kept him alive through 3 deployments, the executives who'd called him worthless, the system that discarded veterans like disposable assets. None of that mattered now. People's lives hung in the balance. Sophia's face flashed in his mind. If something happened to him tonight, she'd be alone. No family to take her in, no trust fund to secure her future. Just the foster care system that had failed so many children he'd known. But if he did nothing, if he let whatever was planned happen, how many other children would lose their parents? How many Sophias would wake up tomorrow to a changed world? Marcus moved away from the door, his training taking over completely. He needed to get to the security office, get word out somehow, assess the threat properly. But as he turned the corner, he nearly collided with Tommy Chen, who was making his rounds with uncharacteristic urgency. Marcus grabbed his arm, pulling him into an alcove beside the water fountain. "Something's wrong," Marcus whispered, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Armed men on 23. Communications are jammed. This is happening now." Tommy's eyes widened, his hand instinctively moving toward the security radio that would be useless. "How many?" he asked, his training as a former NYPD officer surfacing through his civilian job persona. "At least 6. Military coordination. They're planning something for 3 a.m. Marcus checked his watch. 9 minutes. Tommy nodded grimly. "The executive floors are fully occupied tonight. Emergency board meeting about the Kellerman acquisition. 87 people sleeping in conference rooms and offices." The weight of responsibility settled on Marcus's shoulders like familiar equipment. 87 people who had no idea death was climbing the stairwells toward them. Executives who'd dismissed him, assistants who'd looked through him, security guards who'd treated him like furniture. None of that mattered now. They were civilians under threat, and he was still a soldier at heart. "We need to evacuate," Tommy said, reaching for his radio before remembering it was useless. "Fire alarm, emergency protocols." Marcus shook his head. Too slow, too obvious. "They'll know we're onto them and accelerate the timeline. We need a different approach." His mind was already calculating angles, entry points, defensive positions. The building's layout was burned into his memory from months of cleaning every corner, every room, every possible hiding spot. Tommy stared at him, seeing something in Marcus's demeanor that hadn't been there during their casual conversations over coffee and cigarettes. "This is real, isn't it? You're not just a janitor." Marcus met his gaze steadily. "Tonight, I'm whatever those people need me to be, but we need to move smart, create confusion, divide their attention, buy time for law enforcement to respond." The plan formed quickly, born from years of tactical thinking that civilian life had dulled but not destroyed. Tommy would trigger fire alarms in stages, starting from the bottom floors, making it seem like a building-wide emergency that would draw some of the attackers away from their primary target. Meanwhile, Marcus would use his knowledge of the building's service corridors to reach the executive floors ahead of them, warn the civilians, and establish defensive positions. It was a desperate plan, improvised and dangerous, but it was better than watching innocent people die while help was too far away. As they prepared to separate, Tommy grabbed Marcus's arm. "Rodriguez, if we don't make it through this, I want you to know you're the best man I've worked with in this place. Military or not, you see people. That matters." Marcus nodded, emotion threatening to crack his professional composure. "Take care of yourself, Chen. Sophia's going to need her Uncle Tommy around to help her with homework." The fire alarm's first pull sent shrieking warnings through floors 1 through 5 as Marcus disappeared into the service corridor that ran parallel to the main elevator bank. The familiar route he'd traveled countless times while invisible to the building's daytime occupants became a tactical pathway toward the most dangerous night of his civilian life. Behind him, he could hear the confusion beginning, voices calling out, footsteps in stairwells, the building's emergency systems responding to Tommy's carefully orchestrated chaos. Floor by floor, Marcus climbed through maintenance shafts and service elevators, his heart pounding not with fear but with purpose he hadn't felt since leaving the military. The same sense of mission that had driven him through Kandahar and Helmand province, now focused on protecting people who'd never thanked him for his service, never acknowledged his sacrifice, never seen him as anything more than the help. At the 20th floor, he paused to catch his breath and check his watch. 2 minutes until 3 a.m. The fire alarms were spreading up through the building now, but he could hear different sounds too, sounds that confirmed his worst fears. Rapid footsteps, shouted commands, the distinctive sound of tactical equipment moving through stairwells. The attack was beginning, and Marcus Rodriguez, the useless janitor they'd planned to discard, was the only thing standing between 87 innocent people and whatever nightmare was about to unfold. The service door to the 21st floor opened silently under his practiced touch, revealing the corridor where he'd mopped floors just an hour earlier. Now it looked different, transformed by shadow and threat into a battlefield where his forgotten skills would finally matter again. In the distance, he could hear voices calling out in confusion as the fire alarms reached the executive floors. People stumbling from makeshift beds in conference rooms. Executives who'd been working through the night, suddenly faced with an emergency they couldn't control with money or influence. Marcus moved toward the voices, toward his responsibility, toward the moment when the invisible man would step out of the shadows and prove that heroism wasn't determined by the uniform you wore, but by the choices you made when everything was on the line. Behind him, the sounds of the attack grew closer, and ahead of him, 87 people depended on a janitor they'd never bothered to see. The first person he encountered was Catherine Walsh, the senior vice president who'd walked past him daily for 18 months without a single acknowledgement. She stood in the doorway of conference room A, silk blouse wrinkled from sleeping at her desk, her usually perfect hair disheveled with panic. The fire alarms shrieking had awakened her from exhausted sleep, and confusion clouded her normally sharp eyes. "Miss Walsh," Marcus said quietly, stepping out of the shadows in a way that made her jump. "We need to get everyone out of here immediately. This isn't a drill." Catherine stared at him, her brain struggling to process why the night janitor was speaking to her with such authority, such urgency. "I don't understand," she stammered. "The alarm system must be malfunctioning. Building maintenance should handle this." "Ma'am, there are armed men in this building," Marcus said, his voice carrying the calm authority he'd used with civilians in Afghanistan. "They're moving toward these floors right now. We have maybe 3 minutes before they reach us. I need you to wake everyone in that room and move them to the northwest stairwell. Stay quiet, stay low, and don't use the elevators." Catherine's executive training kicked in, the same decision-making skills that had built her career now focused on survival. "Armed men? Are you certain? How do you know this?" Marcus met her gaze steadily, and for the first time, she saw past the coveralls to the soldier beneath. "Because I've been listening to them plan this for the last 10 minutes. I'm a veteran, ma'am. 3 tours in Afghanistan. I know what tactical coordination sounds like." Something in his tone, his posture, the way he held himself, convinced her more than any credentials could have. The invisible janitor she'd dismissed as part of the building's furniture suddenly became the most important person in her world. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear. "Get everyone moving toward the northwest exit. I'll handle the northeast corridor where the conference rooms are full." Marcus was already moving, his mind cataloging the building's occupants from months of observing their late-night work patterns. "Don't let them bunch up in the stairwells. Space them out, keep them quiet. If you hear gunfire, get them to the parking garage and call for help." As Catherine disappeared into the conference room to wake her colleagues, Marcus continued toward the sound of voices, toward the people who would need him most. The northeast corridor housed the largest conference rooms, where merger negotiations and crisis meetings often stretched through the night. Tonight, the Kellerman acquisition team had been working around the clock, sleeping in shifts on couches and conference tables. The first room he reached contained 6 people, junior analysts and assistants who'd drawn the short straw for all-night number crunching. They looked up in bewilderment as the janitor burst through their door, his demeanor completely transformed from the quiet man who emptied their trash bins. "Everyone up, everyone quiet," Marcus commanded. "We're evacuating immediately. Terrorist threat on the building. Move toward the northwest stairwell now." One of the analysts, a young man barely out of college, started to protest. "You can't just burst in here and order us around. You're just the cleaning guy. Who gave you authority to evacuate anyone?" Marcus stepped closer, and the kid saw something in his eyes that cut through privilege and hierarchy like a blade through paper. "Son, I'm trying to save your life. You can argue about my authority after we're all breathing tomorrow morning." The group moved, some grumbling, some frightened, but all responding to something indefinable in Marcus's presence. As they filed toward the exit, Marcus continued his sweep, room by room, gathering people who'd never seen him as human, who'd treated him like mobile furniture for months. Now their lives depended on his skills, his training, his willingness to risk everything for people who'd given him nothing. In the largest conference room, he found the executives responsible for his impending unemployment. Richard Kellerman himself sat at the head of the table, still in his rumpled suit, surrounded by lawyers and analysts working through the final details of the acquisition. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that he was about to save the life of the man whose business deal would eliminate his job in 3 weeks. Kellerman looked up irritably as Marcus entered. "What are you doing here? This is a private meeting. We specifically requested no interruptions." Marcus ignored the dismissive tone, focusing on the tactical situation. "Sir, there's an immediate threat to this building. Armed hostiles are moving toward this floor. We need to evacuate everyone right now." The lawyer beside Kellerman scoffed audibly. "This is ridiculous. Richard, call security and have this man removed. He's clearly having some sort of breakdown." Marcus felt the familiar surge of frustration at civilian disbelief, the same skepticism he'd encountered from embassy staff in Kabul, who thought their diplomatic status made them immune to Taliban rockets. "Mr. Kellerman," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the room's dismissive chatter, "in approximately 90 seconds, armed men are going to come through that door with automatic weapons. Your choice is to trust the janitor who's been protecting this building while you slept, or explain to your families why you valued your pride over their lives." Something in Marcus's absolute certainty, his complete lack of deference to corporate hierarchy, penetrated Kellerman's executive armor. The businessman had built his fortune on reading people, on detecting truth beneath layers of negotiation and misdirection. What he saw in the janitor's eyes wasn't madness or attention-seeking, but the focused clarity of someone who'd seen death up close and knew its approach. "Everyone move," Kellerman commanded, his authority shifting the room's dynamic instantly. "If Rodriguez says there's danger, we listen." As the executives filed out, some casting doubtful glances over their shoulders, Kellerman paused beside Marcus. "How do you know?" he asked quietly. "Because I've been invisible in this building for 18 months, Marcus replied, "and invisible people see everything." The corridor was filling with confused, frightened people, moving toward the stairwells, their normal hierarchy completely inverted. Senior partners took direction from junior associates who'd listened to Marcus's instructions, while executives who'd never acknowledged his existence now depended on his tactical knowledge for survival. The terrorist attack had stripped away corporate pretense, revealing the fundamental truth that in a crisis, competence mattered more than corner offices. As Marcus conducted his final sweep of the executive floors, checking every room, every closet, every possible hiding place, he could hear new sounds filtering through the building's structure. Footsteps in stairwells that didn't match the evacuation pattern. Voices speaking in languages that confirmed his worst fears. The attackers were inside, moving upward through the building's arteries like a deadly infection. His radio crackled unexpectedly, Tommy's voice breaking through with a whispered report. "Rodriguez, they're in the lobby. At least 8 men, military gear, moving fast. NYPD response time is 12 minutes minimum." Marcus acknowledged grimly, knowing that 12 minutes might as well be 12 hours when automatic weapons were involved. The last room on his route was the small executive break room, where someone had been sleeping on the leather couch. As he opened the door, he found himself face to face with Janet Murphy, his supervisor, the woman who'd delivered his termination notice just hours earlier. She sat up slowly, disoriented by the alarm and confused by his presence. "Marcus," she said, rubbing her eyes, "what's happening? Why are all the alarms going off?" For a moment, he hesitated, looking at the woman who'd dismissed his military experience as irrelevant to modern business, who'd processed his layoff with bureaucratic efficiency. Then his training reasserted itself, because protecting people wasn't about whether they deserved it. "Janet, we need to go right now," he said, helping her to her feet. "There's danger in the building, trust me," and moved toward the northwest stairwell with the others. As they left the break room together, Janet looked at him with new eyes, seeing something in his calm competence that her corporate perspective had missed entirely. The evacuation was proceeding, but Marcus knew it wasn't fast enough. The attackers were moving with military precision, and civilian panic would slow the escape routes to a deadly crawl. He needed to buy more time, create more confusion for the hostiles, use every advantage his building knowledge provided. As the last stragglers reached the stairwell, Marcus made the decision that would define the rest of the night. Instead of following the evacuees to safety, he turned back toward the danger, toward the sounds of tactical movement that were growing closer with each passing second. Someone needed to slow them down, disrupt their timing, force them to react instead of execute. The janitor they'd called useless was about to become the most important person in the building, the difference between a successful evacuation and a massacre that would horrify the world. The service corridors of Pinnacle Financial Tower had become Marcus Rodriguez's battlefield, and he moved through them with the fluid precision of a soldier returning to war. Every pipe junction, every electrical panel, every maintenance access point was a tactical asset he'd memorized during 18 months of invisible labor. Now those countless hours of cleaning and repairs transformed into the most important reconnaissance mission of his life. Through the building's ventilation system, he could hear them ascending, professional voices coordinating in Arabic and English, the distinctive sound of tactical gear moving through stairwells. 8 men, just as Tommy had reported, but Marcus's trained ear detected something worse. This wasn't a smash-and-grab operation or even a standard terrorist attack. The calm efficiency in their communications suggested a precision strike designed for maximum symbolic impact. His phone vibrated with a text message that somehow penetrated their communications jamming. Sophia's school picture smiled back at him from the screen, a reminder of why failure wasn't an option. The message was from Mrs. Chen, Tommy's wife, who watched Sophia during his night shifts. "She's sleeping peacefully. Dream about Daddy coming home safe." The simple words hit him harder than enemy fire ever had. Marcus reached the 19th floor through the maintenance shaft, emerging into the executive bathroom that adjoined the largest conference room. Through the thin wall, he could hear the attackers setting up their equipment, their voices now clear and terrifyingly methodical. "Primary target is the Kellerman files," one voice commanded. "Secondary objectives are the foreign investment portfolios on floors 21 and 22. We have 17 minutes before police response reaches effective range." The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. This wasn't random terrorism. Someone had provided detailed intelligence about the building's contents, the executive schedules, even the security response times. The Kellerman acquisition involved defense contracts worth billions, contracts that could shift global power balances if they fell into the wrong hands. These weren't fanatics driven by ideology. They were professional operatives conducting corporate espionage at gunpoint. His military training kicked into overdrive, cataloging the tactical situation with brutal clarity. 8 hostiles, automatic weapons, professional coordination, inside intelligence. 1 defender, no weapons, no backup, no communications. In Afghanistan, these odds would have meant calling for air support and hoping to survive until extraction. Here, in the heart of Manhattan, Marcus Rodriguez was the air support. The building's fire suppression system gave him his first advantage. Marcus knew every sprinkler head, every smoke detector, every emergency system from months of maintenance checks. Moving through the service corridors with ghost-like silence, he reached the fire control panel for floors 18 through 23. The system wasn't designed for tactical applications, but Marcus had learned to improvise with whatever resources were available. He triggered the sprinkler system in stages, creating a cascading wall of water that would fog the attackers' vision and force them to move more cautiously through the executive floors. The sound of rushing water mixed with shouted commands as the operatives adapted to the new conditions, their timeline already beginning to slip. Through the security camera system, which he accessed using maintenance codes, Marcus watched the attackers' response. They moved with professional discipline, but the sprinkler activation had forced them to protect their electronic equipment, slowing their advance and bunching them together in ways that revealed their tactical formation. 7 men moving in coordinated pairs, with one remaining in the stairwell as overwatch. Not 8 as Tommy had counted. Someone was missing from the equation. The missing operative became clear when Marcus heard footsteps in the maintenance corridor behind him. Soft, careful, but not careful enough to fool ears trained by years of combat patrol. Someone had anticipated that building personnel might use service routes to coordinate resistance. The hunter had become the hunted. Marcus moved deeper into the building's mechanical spaces, using his intimate knowledge of every pipe and cable run to stay ahead of his pursuer. The familiar weight of a mop handle became a weapon as he prepared for close-quarters combat in the confined space where his janitorial work had made him more mobile than any attacker could hope to be. The confrontation came at the electrical junction box for the 20th floor, where Marcus waited in darkness as footsteps approached his position. The operative was good, moving with tactical awareness, but he didn't know the building like Marcus did. When the figure appeared in the maintenance doorway, Marcus struck with the efficiency of a man fighting for his daughter's future. The struggle was brief and decisive. Years of lifting industrial equipment and pushing heavy cleaning carts had given Marcus functional strength that most people never saw beneath his quiet demeanor. The attacker's tactical training was no match for desperation combined with superior knowledge of the terrain. Within minutes, Marcus had disabled the operative and acquired his radio, along with critical intelligence. The radio chatter revealed the full scope of the attack. This was Phase 1 of a coordinated strike on 3 financial buildings across Manhattan, designed to crash global markets while extracting classified defense contracts. The Pinnacle building housed backup files for military projects that could cripple national security if compromised. Marcus wasn't just protecting 87 evacuees. He was standing between international criminals and information that could destabilize governments. With the radio providing real-time intelligence on the attackers' movements, Marcus began a systematic campaign of disruption. He killed power to the elevator systems, trapping 2 operatives between floors. He triggered fire doors that compartmentalized the building, forcing the remaining team to move through predictable choke points. Each action bought precious time for the evacuees and complicated the mission parameters for professionals who depended on precise timing. The lead operative's voice over the radio carried increasing frustration. Building systems are being manipulated. Someone with administrative access is interfering with our timeline. Locate and neutralize the source immediately. Marcus smiled grimly. They still thought they were dealing with security or building management. The possibility that a janitor could conduct tactical operations was outside their operational framework. Floor by floor, Marcus used his building knowledge to stay ahead of the search teams while continuing his sabotage campaign. He disabled the HVAC system, making the smoke from their breaching charges linger in enclosed spaces. He activated security lockdowns on random doors, creating maze-like conditions that forced the operatives to backtrack and recalculate their routes continuously. But his most effective weapon was psychological warfare. Using the building's intercom system, Marcus began speaking directly to the attackers in Arabic phrases he'd learned during his deployments. Your timeline is compromised. Building security has identified your position. Extraction windows are closing. The phrases were designed to create doubt about their intelligence, about whether their operation had been compromised from the beginning. The psychological pressure began showing results. Radio chatter revealed increasing tension among the team members, arguments about abort procedures, concerns that their mission had been anticipated. Professional operatives were most vulnerable when their carefully planned operations encountered unexpected resistance, and Marcus was providing exactly the kind of disruption that could shatter their confidence. However, the attackers adapted with military efficiency. They consolidated their remaining team on the 21st floor, establishing a defensive perimeter around the server room that housed their primary target. Instead of searching the entire building for their saboteur, they focused on completing their mission before law enforcement arrived in force. Marcus realized his hit-and-run tactics had bought valuable time, but the endgame was approaching. The evacuees were safely out of the building, Tommy had confirmed via text message, but the attackers were now entrenched in a position where they could complete their data extraction before escaping. The classified defense files that represented years of national security work were minutes away from falling into hostile hands. The decision crystallized with stark clarity. Marcus could retreat through the maintenance corridors, escape the building, and wait for SWAT teams to resolve the situation. He'd already done more than anyone could expect from a janitor, saved nearly 90 lives, disrupted a coordinated terrorist attack. Sophia would have her father come home, and the world would never know how close it had come to catastrophe. But the files in that server room contained information about troop movements, weapons systems, intelligence assets that protected soldiers like the man he used to be. If those files were compromised, men and women serving overseas would die. Families would lose their loved ones because Marcus Rodriguez had chosen personal safety over duty to something larger than himself. The radio crackled with the lead operative's voice, now calm and professional again. Package is located. Beginning extraction. Estimate 8 minutes to completion. Marcus checked his watch and calculated distances. 8 minutes to reach the server room through maintenance corridors. 8 minutes to stop professionals with automatic weapons using nothing but tactical knowledge and the kind of courage that had earned him a Bronze Star in Afghanistan. As he began his final approach through the building's hidden arteries, Marcus thought about the executives who'd dismissed him, the system that had discarded his service, the corporate world that saw him as disposable. None of that mattered now. He wasn't fighting for their approval or recognition. He was fighting because someone had to, because the alternative was unthinkable, because 8-year-old Sophia deserved to grow up in a world where her father's sacrifice meant something. The server room was 2 floors above him, defended by professionals who had no idea that the building's invisible janitor was about to become the most dangerous opponent they'd ever faced. Marcus Rodriguez, Bronze Star recipient, single father, and the man they'd called useless, was about to prove that heroism had nothing to do with recognition and everything to do with standing up when it mattered most. The ascent through the maintenance shaft to the 21st floor required every ounce of stealth Marcus had learned during night patrols in hostile territory. Each rung of the service ladder brought him closer to armed professionals who wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone interfering with their mission. But it also brought him closer to preventing a catastrophe that would echo far beyond this building's walls. Through the ventilation grates, he could hear their voices with crystal clarity now. The lead operative was coordinating the data extraction while his team maintained defensive positions at the server room's entrance. Marcus counted 4 distinct voices, meaning 3 operatives were unaccounted for. Either they'd been dispatched to other floors, or they were positioned in locations he hadn't anticipated. The server room's layout was burned into Marcus's memory from countless nights of cleaning around the humming machines that stored Pinnacle Financial's most sensitive data. 2 entrances, 1 main door facing the executive corridor, 1 emergency access through the climate control room that most people forgot existed. The attackers would expect resistance from the main entrance. They wouldn't anticipate someone emerging from behind the cooling units they were using for cover. Marcus's phone vibrated with another message that penetrated the communications jamming. This time, it was from Tommy, somehow managing to relay information from outside the building. SWAT ETA, 6 minutes. Buildings surrounded but holding perimeter. Need to delay them until breach team arrives. The timeline was impossibly tight, but Marcus had worked with worse margins in Afghanistan. He reached the climate control access point and paused to steady his breathing, to center himself the way his sergeant had taught him before dangerous missions. Fear was natural, his training reminded him. Courage was feeling that fear and acting anyway. Through the thin metal door he could hear keyboards clicking rapidly as the operatives downloaded classified files that represented months of intelligence work. The emergency access opened silently, revealing the server room's interior through gaps between cooling units. 4 operatives worked with professional efficiency, their weapons within easy reach but their attention focused on the extraction process. They'd positioned themselves with tactical awareness, covering sight lines and exit routes, but they hadn't accounted for someone already inside their perimeter. Marcus observed their positions for 30 crucial seconds, noting weapons placement, communication patterns, and the leader's position near the primary server bank. In Afghanistan, reconnaissance like this had meant the difference between successful missions and casualties. Here, it would determine whether classified defense files remained secure or fell into hostile hands. The first operative went down silently, Marcus using hand-to-hand combat techniques to neutralize the sentry positioned near the cooling units. The man's radio and weapon were secured before his unconscious form was concealed behind server racks. 3 remaining hostiles, still unaware their perimeter had been breached. Moving through the server room like a ghost, Marcus used the maze of equipment to mask his approach toward the second operative. The constant hum of cooling fans and hard drives provided audio cover for movements that would have been impossible in a quieter environment. His janitorial familiarity with every cable run and equipment placement became tactical advantages that no amount of professional training could match. The second takedown required more creativity. The operative was positioned with clear sight lines to both entrances, his weapon ready for immediate response to any threat. Marcus improvised with building systems, triggering a localized power fluctuation that dimmed the server room's lighting for crucial seconds. In that moment of reduced visibility, he struck with the same efficiency that had kept his unit alive through 3 combat deployments. 2 down, 2 remaining. But the leader had noticed his team's communications going dark. Alert status, the operative commanded into his radio. Perimeter may be compromised. Accelerate extraction immediately. The remaining time window collapsed from 6 minutes to perhaps 3 as the attackers shifted into emergency protocols. Marcus realized his stealth approach had reached its limits. The remaining operatives were now actively searching for threats while continuing their data extraction. Any further delay tactics would require direct confrontation with automatic weapons, odds that even his military training couldn't overcome without significant advantages. But Marcus had one final card to play: knowledge gained from 18 months of maintaining the server room's environmental systems. The fire suppression system in this room didn't use water, which would destroy the electronic equipment. Instead, it deployed halon gas that would displace oxygen and render the space uninhabitable within 60 seconds. His hand found the manual activation switch hidden behind the climate control panel, a system override that required maintenance access codes he'd memorized during routine inspections. The decision carried enormous risk. The halon system would incapacitate everyone in the room, including himself, but it would also force the evacuation that would stop the data extraction. As Marcus prepared to trigger the gas system, his phone buzzed with one final message. Sophia's face smiled up at him from the screen, accompanied by words that made his chest tight with emotion. Mrs. Chen had written, "She drew you a picture today. A soldier daddy protecting everyone. Says you're the bravest man in the world." The weight of that simple message settled over Marcus like armor. His daughter saw him as a hero, not because of medals or recognition, but because of the choices he made when others needed protection. The executives who'd dismissed him, the corporation that was discarding him, none of that mattered compared to Sophia's faith in the man she called Daddy. Marcus triggered the halon system and counted down the seconds until the room filled with invisible gas that would save national security secrets while risking his own life. As consciousness began to fade, he heard the lead operative shouting into his radio, "Mission compromised, package unsecured, immediate extraction required." The last thing Marcus saw before the world went dark was the server room's displays showing incomplete file transfers, classified information that would remain secure because a janitor had been willing to sacrifice everything for duty he'd never abandoned. In the growing darkness, he thought of Sophia's drawing, of a soldier daddy who protected everyone, and knew that some victories were measured not in recognition, but in the quiet satisfaction of doing what was right. The first sound Marcus Rodriguez heard as consciousness returned was his daughter's voice, soft and worried, cutting through the haze of medical equipment and antiseptic smells. "Daddy, are you awake? I drew you another picture. The nurses said I could hang it where you can see it when you open your eyes." Marcus blinked slowly, his vision focusing on the concerned face of 8-year-old Sophia, leaning over his hospital bed. Her honey-colored hair was pulled back in pigtails, and she clutched a folded piece of construction paper in her small hands. Behind her, the afternoon sunlight streamed through windows that looked out over a Manhattan that had no idea how close it had come to disaster 3 days ago. "Hey, sunshine," Marcus whispered, his voice hoarse from the ventilator that had kept him breathing while the halon gas worked its way out of his system. "How long have you been waiting for me to wake up?" "Since forever," Sophia replied with the dramatic certainty that only children could muster. "Mrs. Chen brought me every day after school. She said you were sleeping because you helped save lots of people." As Marcus struggled to sit up, the events of that night flooded back. The server room, the halon gas, the desperate gamble that had stopped the data extraction with seconds to spare. He'd awakened briefly in the emergency room to learn that all the attackers had been captured, their mission failed, the classified files secure. But the details remained fuzzy, lost in the medical haze of recovery. A gentle knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Tommy Chen entered, looking tired but relieved, followed by a woman Marcus didn't recognize. She was middle-aged, professionally dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Agent Sarah Walsh, FBI," she introduced herself. "I've been waiting to speak with you about what happened at Pinnacle Tower." Sophia looked between the adults with the intuitive understanding children develop when grown-ups need to discuss serious matters. "Can I go color in the waiting room?" she asked. "Mrs. Chen said there's a kids area with good markers." Marcus nodded, kissing her forehead as she carefully placed her folded drawing on his bedside table before following Tommy out. Agent Walsh settled into the visitor's chair, her expression mixing professional respect with genuine curiosity. "Mr. Rodriguez, I've been investigating corporate espionage for 12 years, and I've never seen anything like what you accomplished. According to the security footage and radio intercepts, you single-handedly disrupted a coordinated attack by 8 professional operatives using nothing but building systems and military training." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, unused to praise from federal agents. "I just did what needed to be done, ma'am. The files they were after contained information that could have gotten soldiers killed. That made it personal." Agent Walsh leaned forward slightly. "The files they extracted before your intervention contained partial intelligence about overseas operations, weapons systems, troop movements. If they'd completed their mission, the damage would have been catastrophic." She paused, consulting notes from a leather portfolio. The attackers were part of an international network that's been targeting defense contractors across 3 continents. This was their most ambitious operation, and you stopped it with improvised tactics that impressed our tactical teams. Marcus felt a familiar discomfort with recognition. "I was just the janitor who happened to be in the right place, Agent Walsh. Anyone with military training would have done the same thing." The FBI agent shook her head firmly. "That's not true, and you know it. We interviewed every person you evacuated from that building. 87 people who owe their lives to someone they dismissed as invisible maintenance staff. They're seeing you very differently now, As if to prove her point, the hospital room door opened to admit a stream of visitors that surprised Marcus completely. Catherine Walsh, the senior vice president who'd been the first person he'd evacuated, entered carrying a bouquet of flowers and wearing an expression of profound gratitude. Behind her came Richard Kellerman, the businessman whose acquisition had been the target of the attack, followed by Janet Murphy, Marcus's former supervisor. Even some of the junior analysts he'd roused from their late-night work sessions had come to pay their respects. "Mr. Rodriguez," Catherine began, her voice carrying an emotion Marcus had never heard from her during 18 months of working in the same building. "I owe you an apology and a debt I can never repay. For 18 months I walked past you every day without seeing the hero standing right in front of me. That stops now." Richard Kellerman stepped forward, his usual corporate confidence tempered by genuine humility. "Marcus, I've built my career on recognizing valuable assets, and I completely missed the most valuable person in my own building. The defense contracts you protected represent billions in national security investments. More importantly, you saved lives without any thought for your own safety." Janet Murphy, who had delivered his termination notice just days earlier, could barely meet his eyes as she spoke. "I processed your layoff like routine paperwork, never bothering to read your military record or understand what you'd sacrificed for this country. I was so focused on budget numbers that I forgot we were dealing with human beings. That was my failure, not yours." Marcus felt overwhelmed by the attention, the recognition that had been absent for so long, suddenly flooding over him like a tide. "I appreciate you all coming," he said carefully, "but I was just doing my job. Protecting people has always been my job, whether I was wearing a uniform or coveralls." Agent Walsh spoke up from her position near the window. "Actually, Mr. Rodriguez, that brings me to why I'm here. The FBI would like to offer you a position with our corporate security division. Your combination of military training and civilian building operations experience is exactly what we need to prevent attacks like this." Before Marcus could respond, Richard Kellerman interjected. "With respect to Agent Walsh, Marcus belongs in the private sector. Kellerman Industries is prepared to offer him an executive position in corporate security, with a salary commensurate with his true value and skills that clearly exceed what any of us recognized." The offers continued as other executives added their voices, each trying to recruit the janitor they'd ignored for 18 months. Marcus listened politely, but his attention kept drifting to the folded drawing Sophia had left on his bedside table. Whatever decisions he made about his future, they would be filtered through one simple question: what was best for his daughter? After the visitors had left with promises to follow up once he'd recovered, Marcus finally opened Sophia's drawing. The picture showed a man in coveralls standing in front of a tall building, his arms outstretched protectively over smaller figures representing the people he'd saved. At the top of the page, in careful 8-year-old printing, she'd written, "My daddy, the hero." Tommy returned with Sophia, as visiting hours were ending, but the little girl had one more surprise. She climbed carefully onto the hospital bed and pulled out a small wrapped package. "It's from all the kids at school," she announced proudly. "When Mrs. Patterson heard about what you did, she had everyone make something for the brave daddy who protected people." Inside the package was a collection of drawings and cards from Sophia's classmates, each one depicting Marcus as everything from a superhero to a knight in shining armor. One drawing showed him with a cape made of cleaning supplies. Another portrayed him standing guard over a building full of grateful people. The children's innocent perspective stripped away all the corporate complexity and reduced his actions to their essential truth. He was someone who protected others when they needed help. Dr. Martinez, the physician who'd been monitoring his recovery, arrived for evening rounds with surprisingly good news. "Your oxygen levels have returned to normal, and the neurological tests show no lasting effects from the halon exposure. We can discharge you tomorrow morning, but I want you to take it easy for at least a week. What you did was heroic, but it also put significant stress on your cardiovascular system." That evening, as Sophia dozed in the chair beside his bed, Marcus reflected on how completely his world had changed in less than a week. The invisible janitor had become a recognized hero. The dismissed veteran had proven his value in the most dramatic way possible. Job offers that would secure Sophia's future had replaced termination notices. But beneath the external transformation, Marcus realized something more important had occurred. For 18 months, he'd allowed other people's dismissive judgments to diminish his sense of self-worth. He'd accepted invisibility as the price of stable employment, had internalized the corporate world's assessment of his value. The terrorist attack had forced him to remember who he really was beneath the coveralls and quiet demeanor. He was Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez, Bronze Star recipient, a man who'd volunteered for dangerous missions to protect people he'd never met. That identity hadn't disappeared when he'd left the military. It had simply been waiting for the moment when it was needed most. The building's executives hadn't made him a hero by recognizing his actions. He'd always been a hero. They'd just finally opened their eyes to see it. The next morning brought a media frenzy that Marcus had never anticipated. News vans lined the street outside the hospital, reporters eager to interview the janitor who'd stopped an international terrorist plot. Agent Walsh arrived early to help manage the situation, but she brought unexpected news that complicated his newfound celebrity. The network we disrupted was part of a larger operation, she explained, as they walked toward the hospital's exit. We need your insights to prevent similar attacks on other financial centers. Your understanding of building systems and security vulnerabilities could save countless lives. This isn't about recognition anymore, Mr. Rodriguez. This is about duty to something larger than any individual building or corporation. Marcus paused at the hospital doors, looking out at the crowd of reporters and cameras, waiting to document his story. For 18 months he'd been invisible. Now everyone wanted to see him, to understand how the quiet janitor had become an unlikely hero. But the attention felt less important than the small hand that gripped his as Sophia stood beside him, ready to face whatever came next. The reporters surged forward as Marcus emerged from the hospital, but he stopped to address them with the same calm authority he'd used during the crisis. "I'm not a hero because I stopped some bad guys," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the crowded sidewalk. "I'm a hero because I'm Sophia's dad. And she needed me to come home safe. Everything else was just doing my job." The questions came rapid fire about his military service, his time as a janitor, his plans for the future. Marcus answered them thoughtfully, but his focus remained on the little girl beside him who'd never doubted that her daddy was someone special. When a reporter asked what message he had for other veterans struggling to find their place in civilian life, his response was immediate and heartfelt. "Your service matters," he said, looking directly into the cameras. "Your skills matter. Your experience matters. Don't let anyone convince you that you're disposable because you wore a uniform instead of a suit. This country needs people who understand duty, who know that protecting others is more important than protecting yourself. You are heroes, whether anyone recognizes it or not." As they walked through the crowd toward Tommy's car, Sophia tugged on Marcus's sleeve. "Daddy, are you going to keep being a janitor?" she asked, with the innocent directness that cut straight to the heart of complex issues. Marcus smiled down at his daughter, the most important person in his world. "I'm going to keep being someone who protects people, sunshine. Sometimes that might mean wearing coveralls, sometimes it might mean wearing a suit, but it will always mean being your daddy first." The car pulled away from the hospital, with Sophia chattering excitedly about all the people who wanted to meet her famous father, while Marcus contemplated the offers that would reshape their future. FBI agent, corporate security executive, consultant to building safety firms, the possibilities seemed endless. But whatever path he chose, it would be guided by the same principle that had driven him through 3 combat deployments and 1 terrifying night in a Manhattan skyscraper. Some people were called to protect others, and that calling didn't disappear when the uniform came off or when civilian employers failed to recognize its value. Marcus Rodriguez had always been a protector. Now the world finally understood what Sophia had known all along. Sometimes heroes wore coveralls and pushed mop buckets, and their true measure wasn't found in recognition or reward, but in the quiet courage to stand up when others needed someone to stand for them. 3 months later, Marcus stood in his new office at FBI headquarters, reviewing case files that would have seemed impossible during his janitor days. The corporate security division had given him resources he'd never imagined, authority that extended far beyond a single building's maintenance corridors. But the most meaningful change wasn't in his title or salary. It was in how he saw himself and how the world saw people like him. Sophia burst through his office door after school, her backpack heavy with books and her latest artwork. She'd insisted on visiting Daddy's new workplace, curious about the building where important people made decisions that kept everyone safe. The FBI agents and analysts she met treated her with the same respect they showed Marcus, understanding that family was the foundation of everything he did. "Daddy, look what I made in art class," she announced, pulling out a painting that showed figures in different uniforms standing together around a large building. There was a soldier, a police officer, a firefighter, a doctor, and in the center, a man in gray coveralls holding a mop. At the top, she'd painted the words, "All heroes matter." Marcus knelt to her level, studying the painting with the seriousness it deserved. "This is beautiful, sunshine. Tell me about everyone you painted." Sophia pointed to each figure enthusiastically. "The soldier protects us from bad guys far away. The police officer stops bad guys here. The firefighter saves people from fires. The doctor makes sick people better. And the janitor," she pointed to the central figure, "he protects everyone by keeping their places safe and clean." The simple wisdom in her explanation reminded Marcus why his story had resonated with so many people. Children understood intuitively what adults often missed, that every job performed with integrity contributed to society's safety and well-being. His heroic moment hadn't made him valuable. His value had always existed, waiting for the right moment to be recognized. Agent Walsh appeared in the doorway, smiling at the scene of Marcus examining Sophia's artwork. "Sorry to interrupt, but we just received intelligence about potential threats to 3 more financial centers. The network we disrupted is trying to regroup, and they're specifically targeting buildings with vulnerable maintenance access points." Marcus looked up from Sophia's painting, the transition from father to federal agent happening seamlessly. "Which cities?" he asked, already mentally cataloging the building systems and security protocols he'd need to assess. "Boston, Chicago, and Philadelphia," Agent Walsh replied. "All have significant defense contractor presences, all employ large maintenance staffs, and all have the kind of invisible security gaps that our previous experience taught us to recognize." Sophia listened to the adult conversation with the focused attention she'd learned from living with someone whose work involved protecting people. She understood that her daddy's job sometimes required him to travel to places where bad people were trying to hurt good people, and that his special skills made him one of the few people who could stop them. "Can I help?" she asked suddenly, causing both adults to look at her in surprise. "I know a lot about buildings from all the times I visited Daddy at work, and kids notice things that grown-ups miss because everyone thinks we're not paying attention." Marcus exchanged glances with Agent Walsh, both recognizing the truth in Sophia's observation. "You're right that kids notice things adults overlook," Agent Walsh said thoughtfully. "But the help we need from you is different. We need you to keep being the person who reminds your father why this work matters, why protecting people is worth the risks he takes. That's the most important job of all." Later that evening, as they shared dinner in their new apartment, Marcus reflected on how completely their lives had transformed. The insurance settlement from his halon gas exposure had provided financial security he'd never expected. The federal salary meant Sophia could attend the art school she'd dreamed of, pursue opportunities that had seemed impossible during their Brooklyn days. But the real change was deeper than economics or career advancement. Marcus had rediscovered his sense of purpose, his understanding that military service hadn't ended with his discharge papers. It had simply evolved into a different kind of mission, one that required the same courage and dedication he'd shown in Afghanistan, applied to threats that existed in the heart of American cities. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Tommy Chen's voice carried the familiar warmth of friendship forged in crisis. "Rodriguez, you need to see the news. They're doing a follow-up story about Pinnacle Tower, interviewing some of the maintenance workers from other buildings. You started something bigger than you realize." Marcus turned on the television to find a reporter interviewing janitors, security guards, and facilities workers from across the city. Each person spoke about feeling more valued since the Pinnacle Tower incident, about supervisors who'd taken time to learn their names and understand their backgrounds, about corporate cultures slowly shifting to recognize the dignity and importance of every employee. One woman, a night cleaner at a law firm, looked directly into the camera as she spoke. "Marcus Rodriguez showed us that invisible doesn't mean unimportant. We see everything that happens in these buildings. We know when something's not right. Now people listen when we speak up, because they understand that we're all part of keeping everyone safe." Sophia watched the interviews with obvious pride, pointing excitedly when her father's picture appeared on screen. "That's my daddy," she announced to the empty apartment, as if the world needed reminding. "He helps people remember that everyone has superpowers, even if they're not the kind you see in comic books." The segment concluded with footage of Marcus addressing a gathering of veterans and civilian workers, his message carrying the authority of someone who'd lived both sides of the experience. "Your worth isn't determined by your job title or your uniform," he told the assembled crowd. "It's determined by your willingness to serve something larger than yourself, whether you're carrying a rifle in Afghanistan or carrying keys to protect an office building in Manhattan." As the program ended, Marcus realized that his story had become part of a larger narrative about recognition, dignity, and the countless ways people served their communities without expecting acclaim. The terrorist attack had been stopped in 8 minutes, but the real victory was playing out in conversations, happening in break rooms and boardrooms across the country. Sophia climbed into his lap as he turned off the television, her small weight a reminder of everything he'd fought to protect. "Daddy," she said with the serious tone she used for important observations, "I think your superhero power is helping other people find their superhero powers." Marcus hugged her tightly, understanding that his 8-year-old daughter had identified something that policy experts and corporate consultants had missed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new buildings to assess, new threats to neutralize. But tonight, Marcus Rodriguez sat in his comfortable apartment with his daughter in his arms, knowing that the most important battle had already been won. Not against international terrorists or corporate espionage networks, but against the assumption that some people's contributions mattered more than others. The invisible heroes were still out there, still ready to step forward when needed, but they were no longer quite as invisible. And that change, more than any individual act of heroism, would make the world a safer place for Sophia and all the children who deserve to grow up knowing that every person's service had value, regardless of the uniform they wore or the tools they carried.